Good morning. Hello, my name is Clint, and welcome to Faulty Eyes. To quote Paul Atreides, hype is the mind killer. At least, that's what I think he said. It's good to be excited, to look forward to something. It helps us get through our meager, meaningless lives to have something on the horizon that we want to reach, whether it's a good TV show, a movie, or an album drop, or in this case, a video game. A $100 redo investment that's sure to give us hours of enjoyment, and if it doesn't, well, that's some hard-earned money down the drain. Reality really lives up to our dreams. Take, for example, my dream of actually getting views on YouTube. The cold hard reality of Starfield is that it will likely be just another Bethesda game and not the endless epic space sim of our dreams. So, thank God it's on Game Pass, I guess. So we'll be only investing an extra $50 redos to play it early. That is if we pay anything extra at all. So yeah, you read the title right. Don't let your expectations ruin Starfield. Playing through Skyrim again recently reminded me that no other studio does what Bethesda does quite like Bethesda. There just aren't that many games in that Bethesda open world style. A vast open world sandbox that doesn't lock you into a set path with just enough story, context, and choice to roleplay your very own character, to go your own way, with a myriad of systems that work together to create unique, emergent moments, despite, or sometimes because of, the now patented Bethesda jank. An example of a Bethesda-style emergent story is when the local barkeep in my playthrough of Skyrim recently complained about her husband while a polar bear ate him alive behind her. After I'd ran into the bar to escape said bear, thinking it couldn't get through the door or the loading screen. I was wrong. Another example is the weirdness of finding out my favourite blacksmith was murdered because a delivery guy ran up to me and told me she had left me in her will for whatever reason and had been randomly murdered by a cult that I hadn't noticed on my way into town. These are just a few examples of the weird, unscripted Bethesda moments that happen constantly throughout your playthrough of their games. But Bethesda's scripted stories rarely ever have much weight to them. It only takes a few hours to go from Thief Guild shit kicker to their leader with very little engaging plot happening in between. By the end of Skyrim, I'd offered my soul to about 5 different deities without thinking too much about it. Sure, there's some fun little stories here and there, but none of it's exactly Academy Award worthy. It's not exactly top-tier storytelling that you'd find in an HBO drama or even a game like The Last of Us. It doesn't have the emotional weight it could have if it had been more scripted and structured to pull on your heartstrings. But wouldn't a scripted Bethesda game take away from their signature style? Bethesda games are more about what you put into them and what you're willing to take away. You sacrifice the structured plot for the freedom their worlds offer, and if you're willing to write your own headcanon as you go, then you'll have a very unique experience. There are rarely any stories in any storytelling medium where the hero runs away from a polar bear because they can't fight it yet, and then hides in a nearby bar before watching it kill the barmaid's husband in front of her, while she chats to you about how little he's been doing around the place. It's not exactly the most compelling storytelling, and sure, we have to forgive her for not really reacting at all to what just transpired. But it's these little moments that add up to creating an overall engaging and special experience that can only be found in a Bethesda game. My favourite example is in Fallout New Vegas. While that game's not made by Bethesda, it was created in Bethesda's Fallout 3 engine and is a Bethesda-style open world. It had one of the most impactful non-scripted moments that I'd ever experienced in a video game, and have yet to see anything like it replicated in any game since. Fallout New Vegas had a ghoul named Rule, played by Danny Trejo. He quickly became one of my favourite companions to have around. He got my best armour and I took him with me through multiple missions. Like most Bethesda games, Rule had very little to say, and only a little bit of character to kind of make him an actual character, but I liked him because he was with me most of the time, and it helped me through a few tough scrapes. Together we went into the Brotherhood of Steel base to blow it up from the inside, which was scripted. But it's on the way out of that base that the emergent storytelling came into play. Because after setting off the bomb, every Brotherhood of Steel member was on my ass, ready to kill me and Rule on the way out. And they did that over and over again. I reloaded what felt like 100 times to try and escape the Brotherhood of Steel base. The only time I managed to get through with a slither of health was when Rule took the bullets for me. They killed Rule right at the exit, and I got to get out victorious. But my friend Rule now was dead, and the armor and weapons I'd left with him were gone forever. He had sacrificed himself for me. Sure, it wasn't intentional on his end, he just happened to get hit more on the way out this time than me. But the important thing was that it felt like it was on purpose. To me, Raul had sacrificed himself to save me. It felt like a moment that was truly unique to me. I could reload a save over and over again to try and save him, but it would take away from one of the best moments of storytelling a video game had ever offered me to this point. This is the promise of a Bethesda game. Whether it's a mammoth falling from the sky, a barkeep's final moments with a polar bear, or Raul sacrificing himself for me, this is what makes experiencing a Bethesda game great. It's not the tightly scripted moments, it's the systems, scripted and unscripted, smashing into each other and creating something that feels unique to the player. Whether it's your choice in which faction you want to join, or for you to run away from the bear, regardless of the consequences, Bethesda lets you choose how you engage with its worlds. You can go off the beaten track to never return to it, or you can tick off every mission, even if it makes little sense for your character to do all of them. You can roleplay a character who does the right thing, or you can just steal from everyone behind their backs and pretend you're altruistic. It's this freedom that works, even if it comes at the expense of a world that makes sense. If we expect Starfield's story to be as impactful as the recent God of War or The Last of Us, then we will likely be disappointed. If we go in expecting the characters to be as fleshed out as a linear narrative-driven game, then we will also probably be disappointed. Sure, I want Starfield to put more effort into making its characters truly shine and feel real, reacting to the world around them like Persona 5 or Xenoblade 3. But these games are more structured and more character-driven. They may let you make some choices along the way, but they're choices that make sense for these characters. You can't choose to slaughter a town of people for no reason in Xenoblade 3, or ignore the main plot in Persona. I want Starfield's story to feel as engaging as a structured linear narrative-driven game. But by design, it almost can't be. The more forks in the road, the harder it is going to be to pave them all. And there's a big difference between developing an open world that you can actually interact with in real time and in first person, than a third-person world that's turn-based that can be a little bit more static. I don't mind that the NPCs in Diablo just stand there, but in a first-person game I have a bit more expectation that they'll move around a little bit. A turn-based RPG fight can be just as fun in a square room, but a first-person shooter level needs a bit more work for you to actually move around in and engage with. It needs cover, verticality, a few more corners. Of course, Persona can be 120 hours of mostly tight and engaging storytelling when it is barely animated and follows a pretty linear path, but a first-person world has to feel so much more real for it to be immersive. There's so much more that has to go into its environments, its animation for it to work. Then to add non-linear stories on top of that, well, then it can't be as tight or as singularly focused. At least not to the level of a more linear game. Not yet, anyway. Could Bethesda surprise me and create truly compelling characters and stories that feel more structured? Maybe. If that's even possible. If we're going to manage our expectations here so that we can actually enjoy what Bethesda cooks up for us, then we need to look at Bethesda's prior games, where most characters repeat the same lines of dialogue, and where the companions have just enough story to scrape together a vague idea of who they are as a person, where they run out of things to say once you've completed their side quests and eventually feel as wooden as the town guards, because they're just one of 100 characters you could choose to be engaging with, unlike a game that has just a few dozen characters that they have to focus on. Because Bethesda want you to choose whether or not you speak to them, whether or not you keep them around, rather than force you to spend the entire ride with them. In a more linear, tight narrative, characters can be more integral to the plot and the main character. So how can Bethesda do that if you can also choose not to have those characters around at all? So I think it's best to start off from a place of suspicion, to be a little bit cynical. I tend to enjoy games more when I start them that way, because I've been burnt before. Early in my video game experience, when I was just a boy, hopeful and naive. Peter Molyneux taught me this valuable lesson with his Fable series. He would straight up lie about what you could do in game. If your character spent more time outside, they would get a tan. If you planted an acorn, it would grow a tree. And Fable was pretty good for the time. A somewhat unique action-driven RPG with some light sim elements. But it was nothing like what Peter Molyneux had claimed. It lacked in so many features. It was just a video game. I then eagerly awaited Fable 2, which again Peter Molyneux lied about. as he amped up features that would never be in the game. And Fable 2 ended up just being another kind of good game that lacked in almost every element of exciting promise Peter had straight up said that it would have. By Fable 3's release, I knew not to trust anything anyone said about a game before it came out, to ignore the hyperbolic marketing cycle that promised crazy new features that likely barely worked if they existed at all. And this mentality, so far, has worked for me. It has allowed me to enjoy games for what they are rather than what they could be. Sure, I'll dream of what the sequel could offer, but I'll really count on it matching up to my dreams of what it could be. For example, I enjoyed Destiny at launch. While the marketing suggested an endless game with a story told over the next 10 years, I looked back at what Bungie had made before, and every game they had ever released was around 7 to 10 hours. So that's kind of what I went in expecting. But it felt like everyone else was expecting it to be absolutely massive. It was hyped up to be as big as an MMO, with combat as good as Halo. But how could a studio known for a few 7-hour campaigns over decades suddenly pump out a 100-hour plus MMO? It was much more likely that it would just be an 8-hour campaign with repeatable missions. And that is essentially what it was. And I enjoyed it for that and moved on. Then, more recently, there was Cyberpunk 2077 by CD Projekt Red. It's a game I enjoyed, if not loved at launch, despite its negative reviews and overwhelmingly disappointing reception. Because to me, CD Projekt Red was a AA studio, essentially an indie developer, that achieved some surprisingly great things with The Witcher 2, a smaller, tighter action RPG. The Witcher 3 was their first truly AAA feeling title. It was, against all odds, an open world that felt as rich and detailed as a Rockstar game from a studio of around half the size. It was a truly amazing achievement despite its rough edges. No one expected The Witcher 3 to be as good as it was. It launched glitchy, and it graphically wasn't as good as its early trailers, but it surprised everybody because we didn't know what to expect from it, and it exceeded our expectations because of this. Cyberpunk 2077, CD Projekt Red's follow-up to The Witcher 3, didn't meet anyone's expectations, because for a start, we actually had them. But there was a lot of things we needed to take into consideration when CD Projekt Red announced Cyberpunk. For one thing, this would be CD Projekt Red's first attempt at a first-person shooter. It would be the first game that ever made set in a large city with drivable vehicles. Cyberpunk was going to be a completely different game to The Witcher 3, and anything CD Projekt Red had made before. The Witcher 3 was built on the achy bones of the janky original Witcher game, and while Witcher 2 was a big improvement over the original, it was still a much smaller title. Bethesda had made multiple Fallout games before it managed to get its first-person shooting mechanics to feel somewhat passable. Rockstar had spent decades honing their open-world cities and driving mechanics, and they still haven't perfected it. So how on earth could we expect CD Projekt Red to nail all of these elements together on their first attempt? Mass Effect 1 had terrible shooting because it was focused on being a large-scale open RPG over being an action game. Most big RPGs sacrifice responsive combat and graphical fidelity for these large-scale open worlds. The Witcher 3's third-person combat was good, but it wasn't the best third-person combat out there. Grand Theft Auto's driving is good, but it's not as good as, say, a Forza Horizon game that sole focus is on its driving mechanics. So there was absolutely no way in my mind that CD Projekt Red could make a first-person shooter that felt as good as a game that was purely focused on shooting and action. And there was no way that they could make driving feel as good as a Forza game. I mean, after all, this is the company responsible for Roach, the horse in The Witcher 3, which was memed for its glitchiness. How could their open-world graphics be anywhere near as impressive as a tightly structured Call of Duty level with baked-in lighting and only a few directions to go? There was every reason to go into Cyberpunk 2077 with low expectations, and I did. I didn't know what it was going to be, and about an hour of play I realized what Cyberpunk was. It was a Bethesda-style open world. It was essentially Fallout 4.5. It wasn't Grand Theft Auto or even The Witcher 3 set in the future. It was an open world sandbox with a little bit more focus on a structured narrative that could at times branch into a few different paths. It wasn't a full-on life sim living your cyberpunk fantasy, it was a kind of linear open world romp with RPG mechanics and a good view. And just like The Witcher 3, it was buggy at launch. And like most cross-gen titles between the Xbox 360 generation and the Xbox One, it barely ran on the last-gen consoles. Without having an expectation of what Cyberpunk was going to be, I allowed myself to judge it on what it was. A janky Bethesda-style game with a somewhat better story and better gunplay. Could it have been better at launch? Absolutely, of course it could have been. And it probably should have been. Most of the complaints around its launch were more than valid. But from a self-serving perspective, I was able to fall in love with it because I went in without expectations. Because of this, the bits that worked well actually surprised me, and the bits that didn't I could overlook. This was, after all, CD Projekt Red's first attempt at a Bethesda-style open-world RPG. And for their first outing, it was actually pretty impressive. Should we blame them for overhyping the marketing? Absolutely. But I can guarantee it would have been received better if we didn't hold it to a standard that it could never have met. So what should or shouldn't we expect from Starfield? We shouldn't expect it to have shooting mechanics that are as tight or as well fleshed out as a modern day first-person shooter. At least not one that sole focus is on first-person shooting. And we shouldn't expect its characters or its story to be as good as a linear narrative that has much more focus on its narrative. We can definitely judge Starfield on its writing and its world building, but if this world is as vast as it seems, or even just as vast as previous Bethesda games, we can't expect it to compete with the likes of God of War or Red Dead 2 in terms of its narrative. What we should and what we can expect is that it will be just as janky and at times wooden as any other Bethesda game before it. Hopefully less so, but even the trailers so far make the characters feel a little more stiff than most narrative-driven games. Our only safe points of comparison for Starfield, and what we can justifiably judge it on, are games Bethesda has made before, like Skyrim and Fallout 4. Does it improve on Fallout 4 in terms of structure, narrative, freedom of its open world, RPG mechanics, graphics? We can maybe even compare it to Cyberpunk and No Man's Sky, even though both of those titles have slightly different aims and goals. Cyberpunk being much more focused on its characters and performances, with a much more linear narrative than what a Bethesda game typically does. And No Man's Sky is almost entirely focused on exploration and resource gathering, which while present in Starfield, will only be a single slice of the pie. And I guess that will just depend on how big of a slice it actually is when it launches. Starfield aims to be a jack of all trades, a large open world sandbox that lets us head in almost any direction. Its resources are spent on quantity to allow for that unique sense of expansiveness and freedom that Bethesda games manage to harness, even if it comes at the expense of the quality of each individual piece that it's made up of. With all of that said and taken into consideration, if Starfield is still disappointing, then either this sort of game just isn't for you, or maybe Bethesda open worlds have just kind of aged out of their relevance as a whole. Maybe we as a collective would rather just have more focused experiences that can be more honed in and sharpened. But if you want to enjoy what Bethesda is offering, for your own good, ignore the hype, manage your expectations, and maybe, just maybe, Starfield will be able to surprise you. And if it doesn't surprise us, at the very least, we can have a fun, janky Bethesda open world game again. So what do you guys think? Should we lower our expectations for a game if it is offering us something different so that we can enjoy it for what it is? Or should we have higher standards and hopes for games as a whole, even if that means that we more often get disappointed than not? Is it okay for us to occasionally accept less refined gameplay if it means more of a focus on story or the scale of the world? Should a company like Bethesda just not make games if they can't achieve everything in it to the highest standard possible? For me, I honestly don't expect Starfield to live up to many people's expectations, but I am personally overdue for a single-player Bethesda-style RPG, to the point that it won't really matter to me if it's not quite hitting the mark. I hope they've improved the RPG mechanics and made the dialogue more meaningful this time around when compared to their prior titles. But all this time, there has to at least be some improvement over Fallout 4, right? But I'm preparing myself for some wooden-ass, vacant-looking NPCs more than a few surface level quests and a relatively limited emotional connection with the game's characters. I hope that Bethesda prove me wrong here. I hope they surprise me. But I am ready to dive in and see for myself. Find out what Starfield actually is, before I decide what I feel about it. So, thanks for watching if you've made it this far. I appreciate the limited views that I'm getting, and hopefully this one gets a couple more. Have a good day, guys.